So now we're going to talk about figurative language. Figurative language is any language that's intended to be non-literal. This is when the author, the poet, the writer chooses to introduce an idea into the real story that isn't actually there. It's just figurative. This is sort of the contrast to the person who always says literally all the time, even though what they mean is figuratively. Figurative language, otherwise known as poetic language, poetic device, or figurative device, encompasses almost everything that you learned way back in 7th grade about poetry. It's metaphors, but it's also similes, personification, apostrophe, hyperbole, litotes, metonymy, and synecdoche. All of the terms that you've ever heard pretty much in relationship to poetry that don't involve rhyme or sound are figurative devices. These are choices made by a writer to evoke a different idea than the one that is the literal truth of the story they're telling. So I have good news. Back in 7th grade, when you argued with your language arts teacher whether or not that line in that poem you read was a metaphor or a simile, and you said it was a metaphor and they said it was a simile, you were both right. So congratulations, 7th grade you. You're smarter than you thought you were. A metaphor is a comparison of two unlike things. It is made up of two parts, the tenor and the vehicle. The tenor is the real thing that you are talking about. The vehicle is the metaphorical idea that you have added to the reality. The vehicle is the metaphorical object or idea that you are comparing the real thing to. So if I were to describe you as a radiant angel, you are my tenor. You're real. You exist. The radiant angel is not actually part of the literal truth of our story, and so when I say you are a radiant angel, unless I'm actually talking to a radiant angel, I am comparing you to a thing that isn't there, and therefore adding in a figurative idea to our literal truth. You are the tenor, the angel is the vehicle. The advanced jujitsu level of metaphorical use is when we have implied tenors and vehicles, when we don't say things as obvious as, he is a lion, but instead say something a little more subtle. If I say, check out the claws on that girl, I'm implying, but not actually saying, that she is in some way a predatorial animal, which is probably true. Perhaps most overlooked is the effect of figurative language, and that is to create figurative imagery. These are images, again, that aren't part of the literal truth of the story we're telling, but instead are evoked only by the language of the writer. If you come into my class and I say, oh, thank God my tribe has left, my head is on fire, well, that's not a literal truth. My head isn't on fire, but I'm trying to evoke for you the image of it being on fire, because you would assume that that probably is very painful and I'm suffering for it. And I'm trying to tell you that my tribe makes me suffer. Now, my problem might be this. My head is on fire is cliche. So many people say that when they mean they have a headache that you, as the listener, probably no longer even bother to envision the person's head as being actually on fire, and so it loses a large amount of its impact. That's why good writers, good poets, they're able to use fresh ideas, fresh language, fresh images, both literal and figurative, to keep their writing exciting. An extended metaphor is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's a metaphor that is extended over several lines and through several comparisons. Rather than just pointing out one similarity between two unlike things, we manage to point out that there are several similarities between these otherwise apparently unlike things. And that's actually where we're going to start. We're going to start with a poem called After Apple Picking, which is about picking apples. It's not about picking apples, because we've already pointed out the poem titles are deceptive, that poets don't write poems that are really about things as mundane as picking apples, although maybe for some that's a very transcendent experience. Our poet, Robert Frost, who's one of my absolute favorites, takes one of his very typically bucolic scenes and imbues it with a sense of something bigger, that after apple picking, which occurs during the fall, something else is to come. Well, seasonal imagery suggests that what is coming is death, because the next season that follows right after the harvest is, of course, winter. And so as the harvest wraps up, we're looking at the next step to come. But we have to ask ourselves, is that really enough? Do we really believe that this poem is about death just because it's set during the fall? Well, let's read it and find out. Take a look at page 720 in your textbooks. give the poem a read, see if you can find any other elements that might point us towards the notion that this poem is actually about death. Now you may be skeptical and saying, I'm still not convinced. Really, Mr. Wu, is that poem really about death? It seemed like it was just about picking apples. Well, have no fear. We've got some other things to point out. The poem opens up, my long two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree toward heaven still. I don't mean to be overly simple, but if a guy is climbing a ladder towards heaven, he might be on his way to dying. Later on in line 7, he says, but I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night. The scent of apples I am drowsing off. So now we have a third symbol. We have our climbing towards heaven. We have the fall giving way to winter. And now we have our character getting ready for sleep. All of this is happening in the first 7 lines. Sleep, fall, into winter, ladders towards heaven. I'm afraid if that's not enough for you, I think you're a little too skeptical about what Mr. Frost has to say. I would hope you don't think that he just likes writing about apples and that we, as American Western culture, have lauded him as one of the greatest poets of our time just because he's really good at discussing how apples fall off trees. I don't think that's the case. To extend this metaphor, if after apple picking is our sign that we are dying because we are moving into the winter and we're ready to go to sleep and climb a ladder towards heaven or whatever else, the apples become the experiences of life, and every now and then we miss out on something. As Frost points out, there were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, lift down and not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider heap, as of no worth. This doesn't mean that things unexperienced have no value. It just means that they have no value to the speaker. Apple cider is delicious after all. The speaker has had enough of apple picking, which is an interesting thing to say when apple picking means experiencing life. Our speaker says that he is ready to go to sleep, that he is, quote, overtired. These are difficult concepts because symbolically it seems to suggest that our speaker is welcoming death, which is not generally how most people treat the coming end of their lives. That's also what makes this poem powerful and what makes Robert Frost an interesting poet, is because he's taking on an idea that not many people would ascribe to themselves, that welcoming death is certainly not the societal norm. Going back to psychoanalysis, our id would certainly tell us that we need to avoid death. Even the superego doesn't suggest that we should just quit. But the speaker of this poem suggests that at some point you have done enough, you have worked long enough, you have experienced and seen enough, that death, the next step, the next part of your journey, isn't something to be frightened of, isn't something to be sought after either, but it's something that will happen and something to be ready for. So I hope you liked Frost's poem. Now I'm going to give you guys 3 more poems that I want you to read on your own, preferably in small groups, to then be discussed, and you'll answer the questions that will appear on the screen. Good luck.